So if you start tracking what's coming in, that is one half of the problem. If you start chasing, as the DEA, when they're enabled, and the FBI chase the actual kingpins, and you get that other side of the equation where you've got the system and technically tracking, but you're going after the actual people that are running the show in Canada, right? So you're attacking the problem from both sides in a smart way. Absolutely, you will crush the curve of fentanyl deaths. But what I add is, and again, I don't want to be cynical, but I've heard from enough people, I don't want to be controversial either, but there's enough smart people in the US and Canada that say there just seems to be just a strange heel dragging and political impediment to going after some of these, what intelligence knows are kingpins.
Hello, welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Peter Copeland, MLI's Deputy Director of Domestic Policy. I will say that there's a growing sense on both sides of the Canada-U.S. border that something is very wrong when it comes to our security. For the first time, American authorities have explicitly named Canada as a threat to American homeland security. Over the past decade, from electoral interference and compromised institutions, the flow of drugs and organized crime, a web of foreign interference and transnational operations has been emerging as a serious national and international concern. But what is the real story? What's exaggerated and what is politicized hype? And how serious are the threats? Our guest today is Sam Cooper, one of Canada's top investigative journalists and the author of Willful Blindness. Sam has spent years uncovering the hidden connections between foreign state actors, organized crime, and Canadian institutions, and his work has triggered parliamentary investigations and sparked a national debate. I know that many Canadians, including politicians and policymakers, have been following Sam's reporting for years, not just because of its tenacity and detail, but because it cuts through euphemisms and discusses issues that many would prefer to ignore. And as Canada finds itself deeply entangled in a global network of state-based backed criminality, I would say the urgency of his work only grows. So Sam, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Great to be with you today, Peter.
Okay, so let's get right into it, but starting with the big picture. For those who are not familiar with your work, what first drew you into this beat of foreign interference, organized crime, and national security? And what has the trajectory of your investigations been like over the years?
I mean, it's quite, interesting when I think back to it. It's been very organic in a way, and I used to play a lot of sports and I liked to see the field and be at the center of the play. And, I think in journalism, it's been the same way. A bit about me, I had always wanted to be a writer of some sort. At a certain time, I wanted to be a lawyer. I decided to go into journalism and sort of, in a way, follow both of those paths. And as a young reporter, I found myself in Vancouver. And I didn't know it at the time, very early days. What I knew was that Vancouver's real estate was insane. The wealth there was just far beyond any sort of, certainly any tax-paying data, that the wealth was well beyond it. And this just became apparent over the years that offshore wealth was a huge input to Vancouver real estate and prices. And this was around the time when I was really getting rolling as a daily news reporter that the U.S. subprime mortgage crisis rolled out. And so I was very interested in financial reporting. And I recognized that a major fraud had caused sort of a real estate bubble in the United States. I saw similar indications in Vancouver because there had to be some explanation to how these prices were just incredibly beyond the incomes of people such as myself, young professional, my
Yeah.
family, my partner, good income, but we were part of a generation that was priced out of that city. And so
Yeah.
year by year, I found out why. It was the wealth flowing in from China and Hong Kong that no one really wanted to discuss, which was amazing to me. At the same time, I just saw incredible drug deaths on the street, and I juxtapositioned that with the incredible real estate wealth. Things weren't adding up, and to cut to the chase, eventually I was the one that sort of broke the stories that gave birth to what's known as the Vancouver model of transnational money laundering. And this proved how massive funds was escaping China's capital controls, coming into BC regulated casinos. And when I say coming in, I'm talking about most of the revenue for the BC government was coming underground from China, talking about over $1 billion per year at the height. And it was drug cash, essentially. This has been proven. I showed that, the path into real estate and the very convoluted path of this money. I was already running up against a lot of you could say business and industry type roadblocks that tried to deny my reporting. No one
Hmm.
could, but no one could. And the trajectory is, once I had discovered how influential this money from China was, I was starting by 2017 to discover it connected to Beijing's United Front Work Department, in that
Hmm.
major figures in real estate and casinos were showing up in Chinese state-linked networks. And so drawing that line of 2017, from 2010 to 2017, I'm discovering the Vancouver model and how influential it is on Canada's West Coast economy. This is criminal funds. Uh, all of the elite, really political business elite, is involved in it in some way. Lawyers, very involved, bankers involved. 2017 and forward, I connect the dots that this is connected directly to Chinese state operations and the United Front Work Department. And that leads to the election interference story that I start breaking in Ottawa. So there's a lot of dots in between, but that's the
Yeah.
general trajectory.
Very good. Well, we need to discuss foreign interference with my colleague on the foreign policy side. But today we're going to stick more to organized crime and drug trafficking in particular. So you're someone who's curious, and you responded to the circumstances, and that led you really down a path here beyond just the influence in Vancouver and BC and the Chinese influence on organized crime here in Canada. Has your reporting and investigations led you to uncover, the full extent of foreign state actor influence on organized crime in Canada? And what can you say about what we know about that and what we don't?
Yeah, I would say again, it was a process of, as a young journalist, I followed another great reporter in town in Vancouver called Kim Bolin. She was all over the Hells Angels and the what we can sort of call the more domestic organized crime. And in that time period, let's say 2007 to 2018, when I'm in Vancouver, all through that time period, the Hells Angels were a big part of organized crime, but incredible gang deaths were occurring across Vancouver. You could not
Mm.
avoid this as a reporter. I literally remember showing up at, let's say, in a isolated set of train tracks in the Fraser Valley, where the RCMP would have a press conference, and there'd be a burnt out vehicle, found on the tracks there. And it was, you had to cover these stories as a daily
Mm.
reporter, and year by year it becomes clear, to answer your question, that there's been a very high level takeover of Canadian organized crime. So the bikers were running BC for a long time, at least people thought they were, but Mexican cartels, Iranian state sponsored actors and proxy networks, Iranian mafias connected to Hezbollah, to cut to the chase, and Chinese triads and state sponsored crime. Let's call them the triumvirate of transnational crime that
Mhm.
became essentially the let's call it the peak of the pyramid of transnational organized crime interrelating with domestic organized crime groups. So let's not forget the Italian-based networks. All were involved, and all were involved, as I found out year by year, egregiously, not only in real estate and casinos, but year by year it becomes clear corporate structures. I'm asserting law offices, banking. We now know the TD banking scandal that connects, as I've revealed, to Chinese triad, as my US friends say, command and control in Toronto, Vancouver. So it's just by 2023, I would say, talking to various experts in Canada and the United States, I've connected that trilogy or triumvirate of Iran, Mexico, and China at the peak of Canadian organized crime. And
Hmm.
it does connect to state, certainly hostile state activity with Iran and China. And in Mexico, I would say
Hmm.
almost a state-like entity, a takeover state entity that is the cartels, and uh, in their aggressive and coercive way have become almost singular with the Mexican government in a lot of areas.
Mm. Yeah, this is really fascinating. And in Ontario, I know this from my time in the Solicitor General's office. You look historically at the major groups that are appearing, and some who are still in the prisons there. It's Hell's Angels and domestic groups, but the the profile and entities involved has shifted dramatically in a relatively short period of time, just in the past decade or so. What can you say about the business lines that, because that's what they are really, that these organized crime groups are engaged in? We hear of fentanyl, we hear of drug trafficking. Human trafficking is a huge issue in Canada, I think underappreciated by the public. And obviously there are all sorts of financial crime and money laundering as well. What are the main business lines, and what do we know about the trends and the magnitude of it?
Yeah, so I'll lean back to my first answer to get this chronologically in my mind, and starting
Okay.
with the Chinese networks. They moved in the 1980s in Vancouver and Toronto in a major way, with the absolute elite of Chinese organized crime in Hong Kong, that I have asserted in my book, Willful Blindness, have direct relationships with the Chinese Communist Party at the highest levels. They set up in Vancouver. And so real estate tycoons, bankers in Hong Kong, who are directly and indirectly at the highest levels of triads in Hong Kong, Macau, and doing business with the CCP in the mainland. That's the alliance there.
Mhm.
They buy major portions of Vancouver, major real estate in Toronto. So real estate first and foremost. This coincides with China taking over Hong Kong, and you just get a flood of through corruption, organized crime, and state actors coming into Canada, mostly unimpeded, and becoming major real estate players. They become, so let's call that a business line, again, connected to that Vancouver model, underground banking, illegal and legal casino activity, another major business line, real estate development. So this is not about just single family home money laundering, which is major in
Mhm.
Toronto and Vancouver. And when I say major, let's call this a business line that my business and analyst sources, some of them with regulatory experience in Ontario, would put it at over $1 trillion enterprise in terms of transnational money laundering going into Toronto real estate in the past decade. Business line fentanyl, business line legalized cannabis has been taken over by Chinese organized crime, as I've detailed. There's other American reporters picking up on this, including ProPublica. So when I say Chinese organized crime has taken over North American cannabis, become the number one exporter internationally, the number one license holder in North America, it's the United Front Work Department that is essentially running that system. This all ties in, as the stories I'm working on, to Beijing's Belt and Road projects, to corruption, which I believe is not really its strategic corruption, involving
Mhm.
Beijing's mercantilism worldwide. Uh, I'll focus more on, a business line, underground casinos that involve tasking, as I'm informed from Chinese intelligence, to entertain Canadian politicians. So let's call corruption a business line. Let's call involvement in uh, law offices across Canada a business line. That is, law offices, as you know, don't have to report to FinTrack suspicious transactions. And I have not only anecdotally and source based, but FinTrack documents that show suspicious transactions from Chinese threat actors going through the accounts of well known Canadian lawyers that I don't need to name today.
Hmm.
So let's add a business line. I read your excellent recent interview with Calvin Krusty. Let's add radicalism on Canadian campuses and how that brings in that same triumvirate of threat convergence, China, Mexico, and Iran, and how they're involved in a lot of nefarious activities. So political extremism, we can call a sort of business line as well. So I could go on, but what I'm saying is that drugs, real estate development, and political activity, legal activity, corporate structures, they're all part of the business enterprise of these groups.
Yeah, it's really interesting how I think maybe at the core, um, we have driving this, this new model of criminal activity is these political interests from foreign state actors. And it gets mixed with the financial gain, and they utilize organized crime groups, the intermediaries, so to speak, who are in it for more prosaic reasons. But if you want to understand the bigger picture, yeah, it's understanding that this is how adversaries of Western democracies now fight, in this new battlefield, so to speak. But what I want to talk about now, Sam, is how you know you're an investigative journalist. You're relying upon anonymous informants to understand these trends. Um, and of course, there's public recognition now to varying degrees that many of these issues are of significant concern. However, of course, there is still, there's a smoking gun, but a lack of, that concrete evidence of, say, fentanyl flowing south of the border. Um, we just don't have even the reporting requirements for, say, the CBSA to release every year publicly it's trafficking and drug related seizure figures. So there's this gap between where I think like you're pushing the envelope, and then there's this reticence and unwillingness, perhaps on the part of politicians, of agencies, to to respond, and a lack of this concrete evidence that shows that, okay, this is how significant the issue is. Can you just speak a little bit about that tension and where you think it's going, where the gaps are? Do you see this on the horizon? Is there going to be calls for documentation and more transparency? Where do you think this is leading?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great point. I mean, I kind of refer to what came up in the Hogue Commission is you had Canadian officials sometimes doubting intelligence and talking about a mosaic of intelligence. That is, we need many data points to put together an accurate picture. And a mosaic is exactly what I use. So when I hear a senior White House official saying, yeah, there may be a figure of, 40 kilograms of fentanyl seized at the northern border is all we have on data for the US. At the same time, if you have someone going on a national news program and saying, I've been in the situation room and I've looked at satellite images of super labs, that would have to be pretty brazen to be to be making up a super labs in Canada. So I take that seriously. I don't think Donald Trump, Kash Patel are making things up. And my data point is, look, I cited evidence from Brad West, the Port Coquitlam mayor, who is really the only Canadian politician that's been speaking out against fentanyl and BC's vulnerability for years. He disclosed to me in a story for the Bureau that Anthony Biden, Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State for President Biden, slip of the tongue there, in 2023, reached out to Brad West and said, look, you're speaking out. Canada's got a big problem. Vancouver's a big problem. You've got
Hmm.
major investigations that fall apart. You lack an anti-racketeering law. President Biden's trying to put together a coalition, to work on these issues. And so that's indicating to me that this is a state issue. This is not a Donald Trump issue. And I broke the story before Kash Patel's pointing at Iran, China, and Mexico, super labs and the northern border. I did a number of stories. One of them was I pointed to that super lab in Falkland, and I said the Bureau's sources point to a convergence of Iranian threat actors, a sanctioned Chinese precursor entity sanctioned by the US Treasury in 2023, and Mexican cartels. And I was accurate, and I know I'm accurate because we hear Kash Patel again pointing to Vancouver's port. One more story. I mean, I reported on a senior U.S. expert that I couldn't name. I have, by the way, named David Asher. I've named Donald Im, former DEA, very senior official who's sourced some of my stories. But this expert said Canada. The problem here is the Mexican border is being sealed up. The Mexican cartels are realizing that, and they're setting up more strongly in Canada. I wrote this a
Hmm.
few months ago, and at the same time, I wrote about a Mexican sicario who was seeking refuge, an admitted sicario seeking refuge in Vancouver, who had been subject of Vancouver police investigations. And he told Canadian officials, I'm running away from that crackdown in the United States. So I could put in
Hmm.
my mosaic, I can add, hundreds of data points. Another one, a key one, I was told by my senior US expert that 40 kilograms seized at the northern border, that figure is only from customs. There are hundreds of US enforcement entities that have their own seizure data. For some reason, the US government hasn't put that together and quoted it. But when they do, I think the picture of Canada being 1% and Mexico 99, Canada will start to move closer to that middle figure. I don't think anyone is saying Canada has produced as much as Mexico. I'm saying increasingly they're picking up the gap, and so many data points point to that.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting though that nothing concrete has emerged yet. Maybe your last point there suggests. I mean, we've known this for some time that in fact a lot of the drug enforcement occurs inland. Like it's not going to come through border seizures. Joint force intelligent led operations are where we get the data on the prevalence of drug trafficking in Canada and in American states. But why hasn't something concrete emerged yet? Is it political incentives? Because on the American side, are they just waiting to release this information? I think in Canada, we have a certain self perception that things are much better here. It's juxtaposed against the U.S. Which is just kind of big, bad, and dangerous. So I can see an unwillingness on Canada's part to and a kind of apathy and disinterest among the public. Um, but why hasn't something concrete emerged yet? Or are we just on the cusp?
No, I mean, thank you for pressing on that. You're asking the right question. You
Well,
repeatedly. No, here's my best answer. Look, I'm
mhm,
left as the leading subject matter, I would say, expert reporter in North America on this issue to go out and report stories that neither government, the US or Canada, is really talking about. Why hasn't the US come out with that aggregated figure? I mean, I would not put it past President Donald Trump to give the impression that Canada was a bigger problem than it is. Again, I'm not saying that Canada is as bad as Mexico. I'm saying that Canada is getting closer, right? So all the evidence is Canada's problem is growing, and yet there could be two reasons. Is it political? President Trump, the grand negotiator, wants to give himself a bigger hammer. Possible, quite possible. Wouldn't put it past them. Uh, on the same token, as someone that understands investigation and intelligence, having never been officially in those fields myself, but dealing with a lot of good people, you would not want to say we've seized X amount in South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Maine, New York from Chilap Say's Markham, Ontario network. And we know Chilap Say in Markham is involved, and his network meets constantly with Justin Trudeau's officials. No, I know, I'm saying I know the political piece and how sensitive it is, but there's holdbacks. Certainly, I would think, I would lean towards they're not going to give away their intelligence of where those seizures are. But I'll give you an example. Again, Donald Im from the DEA reached out to me, said, Sam, at the Bureau, you're nailing stories that are in the classified realm and we can't say openly. But let me tell you that the DEA, when that Danforth shooting in 2018 occurred, and there was a 40-kilogram carfentanil seizure linked to the shooter, that is his family member, was associated to 40 kilograms in Pickering. The DEA believed that that was a Pakistani threat network, that there were potential terror links, that China had supplied the precursors, bringing together potentially Chinese and Pakistani threat networks. So again, look at the political convergence and the crime network convergence. The DEA asked the RCMP, can we have a couple grams of that seizure? We have a seizure of carfentanil from Quebec in Atlanta. We would like to see if they match up. And the RCMP shut them down. And that
Mm-hmm.
just leaves the US, that leaves people like Kash Patel, uh, people in the White House, I'm sure, scratching their head. I was told that might have even come up in the first meeting in Washington between Prime Minister Carney and Trump and Vance. So it's a long answer to say, you're right. Canadians are right to keep pressing for give us more evidence. But I'm saying, I'm sorry, people, columnists at the Globe and Mail or talk show hosts at the CBC that have never written on fentanyl in their lives to say that there's not a big problem here and this is purely political. I know they're wrong, and it's disrespectful, in a way, to go out there when you got no basis to your reporting and assert that you know everything in the world when someone like me, now internationally best-selling author on this topic, I'm saying different. So I'm telling Canadians, listen to me. I don't care if I don't work for, a mainstream outlet anymore. I'm the leader on this.
Yeah, and I think, a certain proportion of the population recognizes that. But I think, as you say, it's, understanding human nature, political incentives. People are only keen to move once a first actor has moved on it first and taken the hits, so to speak, or if it's politically advantageous to do so. So it's unsurprising in some respects. I want to ask you, though, Sam, about your perception of how governments and law enforcement, intelligence agencies, border security has responded to some of these crime trends. There have been many. There's a decades long increase in violent crime and crime rates in Canada. That's maybe more connected to sentencing and criminal code, but certainly to organized crime as well. We have a lot of national security, border security, migration related issues, and then, of course, drug trafficking. So, what have federal and provincial governments done to address some of these concerns? In recent years, and then immediately, let's say with fentanyl and the creation of the fentanyl czar, and how do you assess them? Are they hitting the mark or missing it?
Yeah, I'll just be brazenly honest. I think it's, in my experience, again, I've covered this for over 10 years now. My work led to the Cullen Commission of Anti-Money Laundering in British Columbia. The banking portion was completely in camera. So what did we miss about TD Bank or the other, big five banks and their role in money laundering? I think a lot. Why? you know, let's look at the TD Bank 3.1 billion fine in an ongoing, deferred prosecution that could lead to more charges. And Canada, the Ministry of Finance gives them a $9 million fine. That's a slap in the face, essentially, to the Americans who probably are loading up or thinking of loading up with a class action civil from victim families down in the States saying, hey, 9 million, we've got people dying down here. You've got command and control in Toronto and Vancouver of people that are infiltrating your banks through diaspora networks, and you're doing nothing. But Okay, Bill Blair in 2019, to my memory. Again, probably partially due to my reporting. I think they announced something like 100 million to ramp up, anti-money laundering budgets for Public Safety Canada and the RCMP in a budget. Obviously, it did nothing because the problem has only got worse. Back to the Cullen Commission, out of, I believe, 101 recommendations, something like three implemented, no impact. And the most important, which was Cullen said you need an independent anti money laundering commissioner, an officer of the legislature, not reporting to the legislature, to take over because all indications, I'm paraphrasing Cullen's argumentation, are that the political government of the day will have uh, incentives not to to crack down on money laundering. In
Mhm.
my mind, because it's very obviously a major chunk of BC's economy. So we could point to some spending. Another example is, a press release and okay, we have $1 billion now to spend on border security, fentanyl. We have a fentanyl czar. We have some choppers for the RCMP. We've got more boots on the ground at the border. And I don't want to be cynical or jaded, but the people in Canada, the experts, some that can be named, some can't, and the same in the US say, where's the action? Where are the convictions? At that Falkland Land Lab, you have one minion so far facing charges. You're not going up to the chain to the Iranian threat actor who sources chemicals from China, as I'm asserting. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of kind of get to stepping, as Kash Patel said in his
Hmm.
interview on Fox on Sunday. And look, I'm not trying to be hard on Canada, or now I want to be, a critic for America's government pointed at Canada. I'm just saying the facts support that Canada hasn't taken the hard legal reforms and the real actions, the real cases that are needed.
Hmm. Yeah, and well, as you say, I mean, the trends that you've pointed out have existed before the current administration, so I don't think you can be credibly accused of that. But let's talk about then what you think should be done to address some of these areas. So let's talk about money laundering, real estate fraud, financial crime. What are some gaps there, and what are some things that need to be done to really close some of these loopholes?
Yeah, as I understand it, and I never went into law. I'm just paraphrasing what smart lawyers tell me, or smart cops in Canada. In the US, you don't need sort of an index offense or an actual tie to drug money to do a money laundering case. You can take the more, I'll just be very broad here, but take the more indicators and proof of money laundering, such as structuring transactions or the inability to prove, how you got that income, and showing the transactions, and you can get a money laundering case. In TD, they could do a major case like that by showing that employees were sending messages back and forth saying, how is this not money laundering? And another employee says, oh, it's money laundering. We're just offering the convenience that we promise in our marketing. And again, that case struck me because they had individuals in the New York area carrying duffel bags of cash into the teller in a TD branch in that area,
Mhm.
completely consistent with what I covered in Vancouver, with the same type of individuals bringing it into Vancouver casinos. So we need, as I'm told very bluntly by Canadian experts that can't be named, because they're giving me sensitive information. We need carve outs of our criminal code. We need carve outs of our Charter of Rights, which has become an unintended shield used by transnational crime. Every single money laundering case, every single organized crime case that Canadian prosecutors deal with, they're going to face a charter defense. And so, I say in my book, Willful Blindness, we need a RICO, like an anti-racketeering law, uh,
Mhm.
to tackle those patterns and get to the top of organizations, to chase the money up to the top, chase the drugs. You don't need to get, the leaders of these organizations handling a bag of drugs or money. You get the network structure, and you can take down the
Yeah.
organization. But I'll end my answer by saying I've talked very bluntly with, I've been asked by various police agencies to sort of present my findings at conferences. And in the background chatter, having a beer after my speech, they'll say, "Yeah, you're right, but the Charter of Rights won't allow us to have an anti-racketeering law." And I just almost start crying, because if that's true, there's like thousands of lawyers in Canada that are standing in the way of what we have is fentanyl deaths here, and we can't just let it continue. There's got to be carve outs.
Well, that all jives with what I understand as well, Sam. And just with respect to the charter, we'll say that it is in fact quite vague, and there isn't a hierarchy of rights, in fact, and it's more so, I think, the jurisprudence that's evolved around it. But the ironic thing is that a lot of that jurisprudence revolves around some concepts like the living tree, which is to say that can constantly evolve and change shape. So it perhaps stands on shaky ground, but I will
Can
say
I ask
that
you a question?
yeah.
Yeah, because I never get it from an expert. But does that mean, if we have, in my mind, and I'm going to be a little editorializing here, if we have some brave judges that step in there and issue some very strong decisions saying, well, actually, you can do a wiretap on this guy and his network because there's enough, and people are dying from fentanyl, then that can change that living tree. And it's not just the charter itself,
Look,
it's the interpretation.
yeah, it's a great question. I will cautiously answer it by saying, like, look, the living tree doctrine is not in the charter. It comes from a 1930s case, and this is the kind of paradox with it. It's a precedent that establishes kind of a moving precedent, right? So I would say, without being too strong in the response, that yes, certainly it's possible, because all sorts of tests have been created to adjudicate conflicts between rights, and what does Section 7 mean, what does all these things mean, and those are absolutely modifiable. So I think there's reason to think that that could change, but that would take a fair bit of time, because that would require changes to the philosophy of the judges, on the bench. But
Yeah.
it's something that I think we may be working on here at MLI in the years to come. Um, but just back to your point here, because I think it's right that Canada's emerging as kind of the weak link, and you've said this about its Five Eyes. We're the weak link in the intelligence community, and if you do a jurisdictional scan, uh, the U.S. in particular, Australia, some other Commonwealth countries, they have these carve outs. They have these pieces of legislation that allow law enforcement, intelligence agencies, border security to take the necessary actions. Not running roughshod over due
Mm.
process and what have you, but taking those necessary measures to be able to combat or organized crime, and we definitely need that here. That's something we hear from our experts. Um, but let's talk about one other area before moving on. So money laundering, real estate. What about drug trafficking, border security? What are some of the solutions that you think need to be pursued in that area?
Yeah, there's one that just seems like low hanging fruit and a no brainer. I've covered this a lot uh, for the bureau. I obtained documents from Brian McAdam, who's no longer with us, a Canadian whistleblower who was in Hong Kong in the 90s and saw an infiltration of the High Commission, the Canadian, immigration system, uh, where he gathered a lot of it, documents and intelligence, not only from the RCMP but from the U.S. INS, which is now Homeland Security, Western Five Eyes law enforcement intelligence, and his documentation showed that some of the people that worked with him, including, a former head, sort of, I believe, of the Canadian Association of Police. He was a prosecutor in Alberta that worked with Brian and others, leading to a CSIS and RCMP joint project on Chinese crime infiltration of Canada. And they documented that the port police in Vancouver were taken out in the Jean Chrétien regime of the 90s. I have documents that I've reported on where the joint Canadian Police Associations talked to David Emerson, the trade minister of the day, and said, look, we know Chinese organized crime. We know Chinese military entities, and a convergence of both have an extremely strong position in Vancouver's ports. Just my comment, these are the same
Hmm.
entities that US government and Panama have now agreed upon to get out of the Panamanian port system, although China apparently wants to block that transaction. And so I'm talking about, high level Hong Kong tycoons that have Chinese military connections. Per the documents I'm talking about, they told Emerson, they told Chrétien's government, put the port police back in Vancouver. It hasn't happened. 2 decades later, I think someone even asked Pierre Poilievre, my colleague Bob Mackin, at a campaign stop in Vancouver, would he put the port police back in? And I don't think Poilievre answered in the affirmative. I just don't know why not. So the data point here is Delta's police chief did a study, and he found that less than 1% of the cargo and containers coming in to the fourth largest port in North America, that's Vancouver Port, located in Delta, are searched. So, how much fentanyl precursors are coming into Vancouver's port? I would argue a tremendous amount. That's why people say, yeah, they're coming into the Sinaloa area of the Western, Pacific coast, where, oh, what do you know? The very same entities that are set up in Vancouver have port facilities.
Hmm.
Uh, it's called Hutchison Whampoa. Again, set up in Panama. People start to see the patterns here. Vancouver is an egress or an entrance point for the precursors. There's been some major seizures, a couple by CBSA, but how many are getting through to fund, or sorry, to supply those super labs in British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec that are,
Hmm.
by the way, Canada CBSA says we are net fentanyl exporters worldwide. They don't say X amount is going to the United States. They say we're
Hmm.
exporters. So we're, even if people want to die on the hill that only a certain amount is going to the US, okay, how much is going to Australia, Japan, Europe, as
Yeah,
that
that's
problem
certainly
goes?
well known. Yes.
So yeah, Vancouver, my work has shown major, Kim Bolan as well, a major problem. Kash Patel isn't making it up.
Hmm. Yeah, no, certainly, people know it's a problem. We've yet to uncover the full extent of it. I think it's interesting to note a lot of the announcements, and I understand this from being on the political side, in the law enforcement space, tends to focus on, boots on the ground. It's a easy political win, but really, not a lot actually happens at the border. It's intelligence-led work, joint force operations that are really where you get the most bang for your buck. And realistically, I think it's fair to say if we zoom out a little bit here, or a lot, I should say, it's not like Canada is worse than the U.S. in this respect in terms of impact of drug trafficking and crime levels and what have you. Um, and if you look at our economies, they're so import and export driven. There is such a high flow of people and goods, and there's a high cost to putting measures in place that restrict that flow. And so, but realistically, there is, a ton of illicit, you know, substances and even people passing through our borders because it's hard and it's costly to put the measures in place, directly, such that it would have, a significant effect. So I think that distributing the responsibility for tracking information and then having the law enforcement resources to um, ensure that that information, is in fact being tracked, um, that can go a long way to addressing this issue. The precursor chemicals, for example, we need to start requiring all of the entities who are involved in the supply chain to actually report on this. But you actually need to have the resources such that someone will check in on them and make sure it's happening. And so I want to say that the law enforcement and intelligence models they're more geared toward this static kind of point of entry focus, and the political incentives aren't such that you're going to invest in back end intelligence teams and what have you, and make the legislative and regulatory changes to require other entities in the supply chains to track more information and disclose it, and really pay the cost of doing so, because banks, exporters, importers, they make money off of not having to do so. So I think it's easy to understand why the problem is as extensive as it is, and why I think, coupled with you know Canadian self-perception and self-image of ourselves as very nice people where this sort of stuff doesn't happen, that it isn't really being addressed. So I don't know if you have any comments or reflections on that, Sam. I have one more question for you after.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that if we have the legal, whether living tree fixes or actual getting in the guts and changing, and getting an anti-racketeering law, putting some port police in, that will give police, you know, the capacity, and prosecutors, who I'm told basically bat away like almost all cases that are complex, they'll know
Mm,
that they have an actual tool to use when they get those cases. So if you start tracking what's coming in, that is one half of the problem. If you start chasing, as the DEA, when they're enabled, and the FBI chase the actual kingpins, and you get that other side of the equation where you've got the system and technically tracking, but you're going after the actual people that are running the show in Canada, right? So you're attacking the problem from both sides in a smart way. Absolutely, you will crush the curve of fentanyl deaths. But what I add is, and again, I don't want to be cynical, but I've heard from enough people, I don't want to be controversial either, but there's enough smart people in the US and Canada that say there just seems to be just a strange heel dragging and political impediment to going after some of these, what intelligence knows are kingpins. And I'm going to assert, well, I'm going to raise the question, are they people that are important in the election interference networks for China? Are they people that are important in the Iranian political influence networks that are involved in currency shops, that are involved in underground banking? I don't know. I'm not trying to raise a conspiracy here, but I've seen it. I know
mm.
enough of them are. I'm just going to come out and say it, and say it's going to take some political courage to go after the big fish in Canada, I think.
Okay, well, this is leading right into what I wanted to ask you. It sounds like some, justified frustration at inaction. But if you look back over the past decade that you've been involved in this, is the situation getting better or worse? And what do you think are the prospects on our immediate horizon, as there is, in spite of what you just said, a great deal of attention and public awareness of these issues now, perhaps more than there was in past 5 years?
Yeah, again, the very disheartening answer is, and I got this from a person with impeccable visibility on a Canada Finance Committee in Parliament. They said the problem's getting worse. The problem's getting worse since my reporting on the Cullen Commission in British Columbia, which, remember, the banking section was completely in camera there. So how much damage was done, including in TD, from whenever the Cullen Commission was, 2021 until now, to the point where, one of our biggest and best banks is having trouble doing business in the US because maybe things were covered up in BC. Again, not to spread my answer out, I did another major investigation on HSBC Bank in the Toronto area from a whistleblower that gave me documents showing egregious mortgage fraud directly connected to these very same Chinese underground banking structures that had abused BC casinos, were now abusing banking branches in Toronto, should be in the same way as the TD branches were abused in New York. I talked to a government official who was one of, I think I had 8 sources on that story, including a whistleblower and documents. And the government official said the problem is getting worse, not better. And did that really come to the surface in our recent federal election? I don't think it did. So look, I'm trying to bring. I wish I could bring some sugar with the medicine on that one, but I don't see any sugar.
Okay, well, your candor and honesty is greatly appreciated. And Sam, I just want to thank you for your courageous work and for joining us today. And to our listeners, if you found this conversation helpful, please share the episode and leave us a rating or review. It helps more Canadians engage with these critical issues. And please check out Sam's work at the Bureau. I'm Peter Copeland, and this has been Inside Policy Talks from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Thanks for listening.